You're just a bit too broken, but I find beauty in your scars. My mom worries you'll break me, but I'm ready for the pain. They say your heart beats too loud for silence to survive. You're just a bit too real to fade into the background. My mom said you love too fiercely, and I want that fire. They say you're too wild, too honest, too much to hold. You're just a bit too honest, sometimes a wound, sometimes a balm. My mom worries your love will consume me, but I burn willingly. They say your love is chaos wrapped in quiet beauty. You're just a bit too intense for gentle hearts to keep. My mom said you're too real for easy love to hold. They say your love breaks more than it mends. Yet I stay. You're just a bit too wild, a storm I chase forever. My mom worries you love with too much noise and too little peace. They say you're too much, too fierce, too raw, too unrelenting. You're just a bit too honest for quiet hearts to handle. My mom said you love with fire I'm not ready to tame. They say your love cuts deeper than anyone can heal. You're just a bit too wild for calm to survive. You're just a bit too loud for whispers, but I crave your thunder. My mom said you're too restless to stay still in one heart. They say your love is a wild ocean, impossible to anchor. You're just a bit too honest, cutting through my masks like light. My mom fears your fire will burn the calm I need. They say you're too fierce for fragile dreams, but I still believe. You're just a bit too raw to fit inside soft expectations. My mom said you love too deeply for easy goodbyes. They say your soul's too wild, but I want to run free with it. You're just a bit too real, too alive for quiet hearts. My mom worries your storm will drown my quiet seas. They say your love is an untamed forest, dark, wild, and beautiful. You're just a bit too intense to be anyone's gentle sunset. My mom said your passion is a wildfire I can't control. They say you're too much, too fierce, too honest, too alive. You're just a bit too broken, but your pieces shine like stars. My mom fears your heart will shatter mine, but I want the shards. They say your love is a dangerous dance, wild, risky, unforgettable. You're just a bit too honest for quiet souls to hold. My mom said you love like a storm, shaking everything sacred. They say you're too loud, but I want to hear your roar. You're just a bit too wild for gentle hands to tame. My mom worries you'll break me, but I crave that breaking. They say your love is chaos wrapped in sacred trust. You're just a bit too fierce, burning bright when others hide. My mom said your truth is too sharp for quiet hearts. They say you're too intense, but I want all your fire. You're just a bit too raw, but raw is where healing begins. My mom fears your love will consume me, yet I stay. They say your soul is a wild river, unpredictable, deep, unstoppable. You're just a bit too honest, shaking my world awake. My mom said you love too loudly for silence to survive. They say you're too much, but I want every piece of you. You're just a bit too broken, but your scars tell my story. My mom worries your passion will burn me, but I crave the flame. They say your love is a wildfire, impossible to control. You're just a bit too fierce, and I want to get burned. My mom said your heart beats too loud for quiet hearts. They say you're too raw, but I want to feel every wound. You're just a bit too wild, a storm I chase endlessly. My mom worries you'll tear me apart, but I want the pieces. They say your love breaks rules and hearts, but I'm still here. You're just a bit too honest, and that honesty sets me free. My mom said you're too intense, but I crave that depth. They say your love is chaos and calm, wild and sacred. You're just a bit too real, shaking my soul awake. My mom worries your fire will consume me, but I burn willingly. They say you're too fierce for calm, but I want the storm. You're just a bit too broken, but your light guides me home. My mom said you love like a storm, unpredictable, wild, unforgettable. They say you're too much, too honest, too raw, too alive. You're just a bit too loud for quiet hearts, but I hear you. My mom worries your love will shatter me, yet I stay. They say you're too wild to fit into any story, but I want to write ours. You're just a bit too honest, sometimes a wound, sometimes a gift. My mom said you love with fire. I'm not ready to tame. They say your love cuts deeper than anyone can heal. You're just a bit too fierce, burning brighter than any star. My mom worries you'll break me, but I want that break. They say your love is too wild, but I want that wildness. My dear, my mother said you're just a bit too wild to love quietly. They say you're just a bit too dangerous, like fire that won't burn out. My mom whispers you're just a bit too honest for a world full of lies. They call you too much, too fierce, too raw, too unbreakably real. She warns your love leaves scars, but they're the kind that heal. You're just a bit too stormy, and I'm drowning willingly. My mom said your heart is too loud for silence to hold. They say you're too wild to tame, yet I want to be caught. Your love feels like thunder, shaking, fierce, and impossible to ignore. You're just a bit too broken, but I see beauty in your cracks. My mom fears you love like a hurricane, devastating yet unforgettable. They say you're too much chaos for calm to survive. You're just a bit too honest, and that honesty burns brighter than lies. My mom says you're just a bit too passionate for peace. They say you're too raw, but that rawness feels like home. You're just a bit too deep, drowning me in emotion. My mom said you're just a bit too unpredictable to hold forever. They say your love breaks more than it mends, but I'm still here. You're just a bit too fierce, untamed, unapologetic, and impossible to forget. My mom worries you're too much fire for fragile hearts to handle. They say you love like a wildfire, consuming, relentless, impossible to contain. You're just a bit too wild to fit in any story. My mom said you're just a bit too honest, too brutally true. They say you're too intense, but I crave that intensity like air. You're just a bit too loud in a world afraid of noise. My mom says you love with too much chaos and too little calm. They say you're just a bit too fierce to be tamed. You're just a bit too broken, but I adore your shattered soul. My mom said you're too raw to be safe, but I'm not afraid. They say your love is too wild, too stormy, too endless. You're just a bit too real for my quiet heart. My mom said you love with a fire I can't yet hold. They say you're too much, too wild, too raw, too unrelenting. You're just a bit too honest. Sometimes painfully, sometimes beautifully so. My mom worries you'll break me, but I want that brokenness. They say you're too deep, too dark, too dangerous to stay. You're just a bit too much like a storm I chase. My mom said you love with too much noise and too little peace. They say you're too wild to be anyone's quiet forever. You're just a bit too fierce for fragile hearts to hold. My mom said you're too honest, too sharp, too real. They say your love cuts deeper than anyone can heal. You're just a bit too broken, but I see light in your cracks. My mom worries your fire will consume me, but I burn willingly. They say you're too intense for peace, but I crave the chaos. You're just a bit too wild, a hurricane I'm chasing forever. My mom said you love too loudly for silence to survive. They say you're too much for love, for pain, for healing. You're just a bit too honest for quiet hearts to handle. My mom says you're too fierce, but I want that fire. They say your love breaks more than it builds, yet I stay. You're just a bit too wild to be tamed or contained. My mom said you love like a storm, unstoppable, unrelenting, unforgettable. They say you're too much, too honest, too raw, too wild. You're just a bit too real for a world that hides. My mom worries you're too intense, but I crave that depth. They say your love is chaos wrapped in beauty and pain. You're just a bit too broken, but your soul sings louder. My mom said you love too fiercely to be held gently. They say you're too wild, too loud, too unfixable. You're just a bit too honest, sometimes a wound, sometimes a gift. My mom worries you'll break me, but I want that break. They say your love is too much, but I need that much. You're just a bit too wild for soft hearts to hold. My mom said you're too fierce to be anyone's safe place. They say you're too honest, but I'm tired of lies. You're just a bit too real to be ignored or forgotten. My mom worries your love will burn me, but I'm ready. They say you're too wild for calm, but I want the storm. You're just a bit too broken for easy love. My mom said you love with too much fire and too little peace. They say your heart is too loud, but I hear every beat. You're just a bit too honest for a world that fears truth. My mom worries you're too wild for anyone to hold forever. They say your love is chaos and calm in one fierce breath. You're just a bit too real for soft hands to tame. My mom said you're too fierce, too wild, too honest. They say your love breaks rules and hearts. But I'm still here. You're just a bit too honest. And that honesty saves me. My mom said you're just a bit too wild. If this touched your soul, don't scroll. Like, comment your favorite quote and subscribe for more. They say you love like fire, dangerous, consuming, but unforgettable.